Well, good afternoon, everyone. I've got 3 o'clock, so I'll go ahead and get started if that's okay. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah.
All right, great. This is my first kind of time really running a webinar, so if hopefully I've mastered the technology sufficiently, and the dog, who is behind me asleep on the couch, will cooperate. But thanks so much for coming, everybody, this afternoon. My name is Nakia Pope. I am a LEAP Texas faculty fellow and very happy to be one. I'm also newly at the University of Texas Health Science Center in San Antonio as the Director of Academic Assessment and Compliance. And I say new, so I've been there about 3 weeks. I've been on the job about 3 weeks, but they've been gracious enough to let me work from home for a while here in Arlington, Texas, to kind of help the transition go a little better with the family and all that stuff. So up until 3 weeks ago, I was at UTA, where I was an associate professor in the philosophy department and director of the Center for Teaching and Learning Excellence. And so my talk today, my webinar today, is about the core objective of personal responsibility, and it is sort of philosophical in the sense that I ask a lot of questions about this what is sometimes difficult core objective, difficult in terms of figuring out what it means, in terms of assessing it. At least I think it's difficult. And so a lot of our conversation today, I think, will be about what the core objective means and what it might mean in your institutional context. And I think if different institutions get a sense of what the objective means for your institution, then the assessment sort of comes after that. This is really similar to the talk I gave just on Monday at the LEAP Texas Forum. So if you were there, a lot of this is going to be the same, although I have changed it a little bit based on some really good feedback and conversation that happened at the talk on Monday. The talk on Monday really, evolved into a conversation, not really a presentation. And as much as the technology will allow us, I would love for this webinar to be a conversation, not just a monologue. So feel free to drop questions in the chat or just ask questions, via your audio device or whatever is going to work best for you. There's not a ton of us here. It looks like there are eight attendees electronically. I think there are more folks in the room there at Jonathan's institution. But I don't think we'll talk all over each other or anything like that. So I'm happy to have this be a conversation as much as possible. If my contact information is there on that first slide, so feel free to shoot me an email later if you'd like to ask any additional questions. And we are recording, or I am recording the webinar, so it'll be put up on the LEAP Texas website, our YouTube channel, and all of that stuff after we're all done. If it's okay with everyone, I'll just kind of get started and roll on, but please, ask questions or interject at any point during the conversation. I'm totally fine with that. All right? All right. So let's see if I can, oh, it's not moving. Let's move. There we go. All right, so my plan for today, or kind of the plan for the presentation, is first to talk a little bit about kind of decoding personal responsibility, especially focusing on the idea of ethical reasoning. Part of that is in the definition of personal responsibility core objective. So I'll connect that with the Ethical Reasoning VALUE Rubric a little bit. That's the overall goal, and we'll kind of keep coming back to that. Second is to discuss some connections between personal responsibility and other core objectives. I think there's a lot of overlap, and so that may prove useful when we're thinking about which objectives to assess at what time, and if we're constructing rubrics, we may be able to borrow language or ideas from other sorts of rubrics we're using to assess other core objectives. I want to suggest ethical reasoning as a way to frame and assess personal responsibility that on one hand makes it easier, as I'll talk a little bit about. Ethical reasoning is really a cognitive sort of activity, so then we can assess it in ways we assess, critical thinking and that sort of stuff. So it makes it easier if we kind of frame personal responsibility as ethical reasoning. This is sort of the way UTA does it. But it also may leave a few things out if we frame personal responsibility as ethical reasoning. So we'll talk about that, some pros and cons of framing it that way. And finally, I wouldn't be a good philosopher if I didn't talk about some of the potential ethical dilemmas involved in teaching and assessing this core objective. This is, like I said, a difficult one, and depending on how personal responsibility is framed, some faculty or assessment professionals may feel uncomfortable. We may feel we're kind of imposing certain values on students, or they may feel we're imposing certain values on them. So I'm going to talk about some of those potential dilemmas, some of those potential issues, and hopefully some ways of avoiding them or getting around them or solving them. So that's my plan for today, kind of these 4 points, kind of ultimately coming back to that first one about decoding personal responsibility using the idea of ethical reasoning. All right, so let's first kind of take a look at what the objective says, the objective of personal responsibility. It's the ability to connect choices, actions, and consequences to ethical decision making. That's the definition of personal responsibility that's up on the Higher Ed Coordinating Board website. And I see it, as having really kind of 2.5 parts. 2 major parts, right? It's the connecting choices, actions, and consequences to ethical decision making. But to me, when I talk about that, when I see that connection to choices, actions, and consequences, and the idea of ethical decision making, I mean, the first thing that comes up to me is some overlap or some connections with other core objectives. So if we're talking about decision making, whether or not it's ethical or not, to me there's a lot there that sounds like critical thinking, because we're talking about inquiry, about asking the right questions, about defining problems and defining problems well. We're talking about analysis, what data may be useful in making these decisions about ethical issues or making ethical decisions. We're talking about evaluation, which is the right course of action to do, and synthesis often of a variety of points of view or a variety of different data points that may be helpful in making the decision. So again, if we're talking about personal responsibility as ethical decision making, there's a lot of overlap with critical thinking there. There's also a lot of overlap with social responsibility, at least it seems to me there might be, because personal responsibility often, some philosophers would say always, manifests itself in the social realm. So if we're talking about personal responsibility, having some knowledge of or thinking about one's social or civic responsibility also matters as well. Even on something like being late to class or being late to an interview or something like that. That may be irresponsible, right? Because not just because it's morally wrong, but because it infringes upon somebody else's time. It gets in the way of someone else's wants or needs or desires. It may also end up costing you a job or something, or points off of a late off an assignment or something. But there's a social dimension, I think, to a lot of the idea of personal responsibility and ethical reasoning. And so we can look at the idea of social responsibility and some of the ways we assess social responsibility as resources for thinking about and assessing personal responsibility. Oh, see, there's the dog. Sorry. So it also sounds like teamwork, right? The idea of, especially in the idea of consideration of other people's points of view. When we work together in teams, that consideration of other people's points of view, considering other people's perspectives is very, very important. That's often involved in how we think about personal responsibility, especially the idea of ethical reasoning. Guys, I'm sorry, I'm really sorry. Can you guys excuse me 1 minute so I can put the dog out? I do. All right, I'm back. My apologies. And that's going to be recorded and saved forever on the Leap Texas YouTube channel. So that's exciting. But maybe it's a good point. Are there any comments or questions or thoughts about, how personal responsibility might connect with or overlap with other core objectives?
Would it maybe link to communication as well for evaluation of self and self-image, those things?
Yeah, great. I think that's a perfect connection with the idea of communication. If everybody didn't hear that, it's communication and evaluation of self, consideration of self-image, and then consideration of audience, right, as well. You're probably an irresponsible communicator if you don't know who you're talking to, right? And the way to frame your communication in a way that they can understand and appreciate. So yeah, there's definitely connections with communication there. Thank you.
Sure.
Any other thoughts or questions at this point about, how personal responsibility might connect with some of the other core objectives? All right, awesome. Well, I will. We'll move on. So the reason I talked about these connections is I think, when I haven't been in Texas that long and haven't been working with the core objectives that long. And so when I first looked at them, especially when I first looked at personal responsibility, I was confused a little bit on, well, what it was and what they meant and that sort of thing. And one of the things I said, well, how is this different, right, than the other sorts of core objectives? And so looking at similarities and differences was really helpful for me to begin thinking about, how to frame this in a way that is both, teachable and accessible. So these connections to me were important, but also somewhat confusing, right, at least initially. So to return to our definition, right, a little bit, the ability to connect choices, actions, and consequences to ethical decision making, noticing the connections also brought up, some questions, or brings up some questions for me about, what is this thing, and what do we mean? So as I'm framing it, and one of the things I'll certainly talk about in just a few minutes, is a way to approach personal responsibility is to focus on the ethical decision-making part of the definition. But then we have to ask, well, what is ethical decision-making? Is it decision-making about ethical issues, right? So is there a set of things that we call ethical issues? And when we say ethical decision-making, what we're talking about is really decision-making or critical thinking related to this set of issues, right? Whether it's moral issues like stealing or larger social and political issues, like voting or hot button issues like abortion or something like that. When we talk about ethical decision making, is it decision making around these particular sets of issues, which is a way it's often framed, or I guess, is it a particular process of decision making, right? So does the ethical apply to the issues, or does the ethical apply to the decision making process? So an ethical decision making process, is one that abides by, or might be one that abides by a certain set of rules or processes for the process, right? That it considers other people's points of view, that it follows, certain, that it takes evidence seriously and that sort of thing. So we might think about ethical decision making as being decision making about a certain set of issues, but we also might think of ethical decision making as being a particular kind of decision making process, different from a decision making process that helps us decide where we want to eat for lunch, or different from a decision making process that helps us decide what kind of car we need, or what schedules we need to put on our roster for the next semester or something like that. So ethical might refer to the process of decision making itself. And one of the things I think is that if we focus on the ethical decision making part of the personal responsibility objective, there's still that responsibility part, right, that might get left out. It talks about action, right, and the responsibility implies activity, right, that we're not just sort of making decisions, that we're carrying them out, right, in the world somehow. And I worry that although focusing on ethical decision making is, I think, a great way to approach this personal responsibility objective, that if we focus exclusively on the decision making part, that we may be leaving out the responsibility part, at least in terms of the actual responsibility, the activity that seems to go along with that. And we'll see this, I think, right now as we look at the Ethical Reasoning VALUE Rubric from AAC and U. So here, let me see if I can't click over to the rubric itself. Well, I'll come back to that in a second. The quote you guys have here is from the rubric, from that first page of the rubric, where the framing language is and the definitions are. And this is directly from the framing language, which I find really interesting. And, because often I just, to be honest, especially when I look at these things the first time, I skip over that whole first page and I go to the rubric itself. But this is from the framing language. And it's really the second part here is that I want to call your attention to. Pragmatically, it would be difficult, if not impossible, to judge whether or not students would act ethically when faced with real ethical situations. What can be evaluated using a rubric is whether students have the intellectual tools to make ethical choices. So an advantage of using the value rubric for ethical reasoning is certainly that it's not only is it a well-established and sort of thoughtful rubric and a good way to talk about or to frame personal responsibility by focusing on ethical reasoning, but it does sort of leave out, and it admittedly leaves out, right, the activity part. For good reason. I mean, when we were talking about pragmatically, it would be difficult to judge whether or not students would act ethically when faced with real ethical situations. There are all kinds of problems with that, and one is the sheer pragmatics of numbers and observing students, kind of out in the world. Can you do it? Can you do it with a class of 30? Can you do it? Probably not, right, with a class of 50 or 80 or 150. Could you do it with a class of 10? Even if, if these 10 students are out doing internships and service learning, which I'll talk a little bit about experiential learning in a moment, can, faculty honestly, reasonably, and accurately judge whether or not students would act ethically when faced with real ethical situations? Maybe not, right? Maybe not. But I think if we kind of give up on that idea, I at least want us to be clear, or at least I want to be clear with myself, what we're giving up, right, when we kind of define personal responsibility as, ethical reasoning. And as someone who's taught, contemporary moral issue courses and intro to philosophy courses and that kind of stuff, You know, we talk about ethical reasoning a lot, and so I just want to talk a little bit about the rubric itself, and you know, kind of what it can do for us when we're focusing on personal responsibility as the core objective. Let's see if I can, yes, we want the website to come up. Ta-da! Okay, can everybody see the rubric now?
Yes.
Okay, good, thank you. Does anyone out there use the ethical reasoning value rubric already to assess personal responsibility, or to assess, you know, some other core objective, or to assess something? I see Lorraine's in the audience, so I know her answer is yes. Anyone else? Okay. Well, so I hope this is helpful, at least, to talk a little bit about the ethical reasoning value rubric and sort of what I think it asks students to do, or what the tools I think it gives us to assess personal responsibility. So again, the definitions here are really important, right? Reasoning about right or wrong in human conduct, requiring students to assess their own ethical values, you know, recognize ethical problems and the difference in ethical perspectives. And if you look at the categories, ethical self-awareness, understanding different ethical perspectives, ethical issue recognition, application of ethical perspectives, and then evaluation of different ethical perspectives, what you have is sort of a process of ethical reasoning that, you know, you could explicitly talk about with students and explicitly assess through written work, right, or other sorts of students, other sort of student artifacts. So really, how I see this, right, and how I've kind of seen it operate, right, is that, you know, students are asked to wrestle with and write about a particular moral issue, right? Maybe they're given a situation or a prompt, or maybe they're asked to come up with one by themselves, right? And so, you know, it could be anything from, you know, a question like, is it okay to steal medicine for your sick child if you cannot afford it, or something much more elaborate, right, dealing with a particular social issue, or a disciplinary issue, you know, disciplinary in terms of academic discipline. So kind of putting that dilemma or a situation right in front of them, you know, asks them to recognize what issue is at stake, right? That's that ethical issue recognition piece. Understand that there are different ways of resolving or approaching that particular issue. And here, you know, this is where a variety of, you know, ethical theories or other sort of academic vocabulary can be deployed. So, you know, when I've asked students to do this, you know, in a philosophy class, you know, I ask them to talk about, well, how would a utilitarian frame this issue or approach this issue? How would a Kantian or someone who's based on duty, you know, approach this issue? And that sort of thing. So that's the understanding different ethical perspectives part. What you'd want them to do during this exercise, right, is also exhibit some degree of self-awareness, right, that they have a perspective on this, right, that is theirs, and that's informed by, you know, maybe the church they go to, or how they were raised, or the books that they've read, and that sort of thing. So, you know, the wrestling with personal responsibility is also, it's not just an abstract decision making about an issue, it's about, you know, some degree of self-awareness and reflection about what their own moral commitments are and how they got them. And the rubric is pretty explicit about that, right, in terms of, you know, that's the capstone part, right, of the ethical self-awareness. then, as they reason through this, and this is a process, you want to see that they are attentive to, the consequences of a variety of positions, right? So if we go by the greatest good for the greatest number, then, these individual rights may be harmed, right? Or, if we go by a, more rigid perspective that holds certain values are immutable, then there may be a great number of people are harmed in upholding a given moral principle. And so that's the application of ethical perspectives and concepts. And then finally, there's the evaluation piece, which, students in ethical reasoning and in these exercises need to make a judgment, right? They need to come and say, this is the right thing to do. And honestly, and your mileage may vary here, but the two parts, to these to this rubric that I see students having the most trouble with are the recognition, right, and the evaluation of different ethical perspectives and concepts. So the recognition, sometimes it's pretty easy when I've given them the problem, kind of clear cut. But when there are multiple problems involved or kind of overlapping problems or the situation is particularly vague, I've found that students, especially, at the freshman or sophomore level where I usually end up teaching, those students, they have trouble kind of sussing out, what the issues at stake are. So they have some issues with kind of problem framing, which I've seen in critical thinking as well. And then interestingly enough, right, I think, students, I've seen that students have a particular issue in making judgments, right? I mean, they may have a belief, right, about what they think is right to do in a particular situation. But they have trouble saying that other perspectives are wrong, right? They have trouble saying that, well, this perspective is incorrect, right, when it comes to ethical decision making. They sort of fall back on, what a professor of mine a long time ago called sort of a lazy relativism. Like, oh, well, I would do it this way. Other people would solve it a different way, or other people would have a different perspective, and that's fine. And so, at least that's been my experience, that I've had more students had difficulty in evaluating the perspectives and concepts than I would have thought initially, right? Yeah, oh, well, students, they're not afraid to say so-and-so's wrong or this perspective is wrong. But sometimes the evaluation is an issue for them, right? I think, at least in my perspective. So with the kind of the rubric here in front of us and me kind of talking through it a little bit, are there any thoughts or questions, about the rubric itself or using the rubric or anything like that? Like I said, I think it's a really valuable tool, a really good starting point for approaching personal responsibility, even if it may not be exhaustive, right? Even if it may not capture the entirety of the objective, at least kind of, it doesn't, at least in kind of my gut. But any thoughts about it or questions?
Nakia, how does somebody who doesn't teach philosophy deal with the second part of the rubric, understanding different ethical perspectives, concepts?
Yeah, good. So I think my quip in the session on Monday was hire more philosophers. That's how you should deal with it. I'm trying to get colleagues and grad students jobs. But no, so one of the things that I'm going to talk about in just a little bit, right, is the idea of disciplinary identity and ethics of profession, right? So I would urge folks who don't deal with moral theory on a regular basis not to take the names the theory or theories part terribly literally in the rubric, and instead think about, well, what sort of moral perspectives or moral values are vital for a student to be successful in the discipline, right, in my major. So for historians, right, that may be, what counts as evidence, right, and ways to, evaluate different kinds of evidence, right. So there's ways historians talk about evidence, right, and what evidence means and how evidence is important and what counts. That's different from ways physicists talk about evidence. And so in the context of maybe that history class or your particular discipline, those would be the kind of the theory or theories or the kind of the values that you'd want to see there, right, is that there's different ways to talk about, these particular values of a discipline, for that second row, across. Does that make sense, or is that helpful?
Absolutely.
All right, yeah, cool. Anything else? Any other questions or thoughts? Okay, so let me navigate back to the...
I think Tammy had a question.
Oh, I'm sorry, Tammy. I didn't hear you.
She typed it.
Oh, okay. Am I not seeing the chat? Oh, here we go. Oh, wow, there are lots of questions in the chat that I totally neglected. My fault. Okay, so how do you get people to see this in the importance of their discipline? Why personal responsibility ethics is a competency they have to worry about when they're trying to focus on the content area. Yeah, other than it's a state competency. Yeah, good. Yeah, so I mean, I think my answer to that is, is that kind of everybody in a discipline, right? If it's some sense, what I think disciplinary mastery or even disciplinary exposure is about is getting students to understand kind of the rules of the discipline, right? So not just a mastery of a particular set of facts or a particular set of content, but it's about, understanding what it means to do history or what it means to do physics or what it means to do kinesiology, right? And as students progress through the major, right? Even at a 2-year institution, as they sort of progress through, various levels of courses, right? I think we ought to expect them to learn more of those rules, right? To be able to state them more explicitly and then be able to internalize them and use them right within the context of the discipline. So when we're talking about ethics or ethical commitments, or it may even be kind of more fruitful to talk about values, right? In certain ways, that makes people nervous talking about values. But if we're talking about disciplinary values, like what's important to the people who are professionals in this field, what's important to the people who do this for a living, then a discussion of personal responsibility begins to kind of come into the idea of professionalism, not just professionalism of wearing the right clothes, showing up on time, and shaving or whatever before you go to work, but professionalism in terms of, well, what are the expectations of the field, right, of the discipline? And so that's how I would begin to have these conversations with folks within disciplines, who sort of are resistant to or don't see how they might talk about ethical reasoning, is, hey, you're not necessarily asking them to directly address, big moral issues, right, like immigration or something like that. But what you are asking them to do is master a particular, or reflect on a particular set of values that are part and parcel of the discipline, and enable them to kind of make judgments about when those values are important, or when they see those values in the world, or when those values aren't being upheld. So in the webinar, or not the webinar, in our discussion on Monday at the forum, one of the participants brought up the Enron disaster, right? And how, nobody know, or if anybody knew, they didn't say very loud that this idea of, taking people's money and putting it in, unstable accounts and these sorts of parts was a bad thing, right? And so, that's how I would approach this idea about ethical reasoning within the disciplines. Is that there are kind of disciplinary values that practitioners embody, right? That we all do. And yeah, Terry's point about the foundational component areas talks about this as well. So thanks Terry. So I hope that it was at least helpful, Tammy. I'm sorry that turned into kind of a long answer, but really what that does is it it anticipates some of the things I was going to talk about in just a few minutes. So we just skipped ahead. Great. So let me go back to my slides here. Here we go. All right. So again, I think if you use ethical reasoning as a framework, right, to talk about personal choice, to talk about personal responsibility, I think it's totally fine. You get a lot of mileage out of that. You can collect student artifacts. It's manageable. Like I said, it always makes me a little like, especially as a philosopher who's kind of a pragmatist in orientation. I feel like that's never quite enough, right? That personal responsibility is more than just being able to reflect and write on about what one ought to do, right, in hypothetical situations or even in real situations, right? Personal responsibility is about doing that stuff, right? But as we all know, right, that's really hard to see and to measure, within the context of our classrooms or our institutions. And there's probably, or there might be even ethical issues with even trying to do it, right? Hence my next kind of set of questions about, is it enough? So when we talk about personal responsibility, there are behaviors like showing up on time, feeling responsible for our fellow people, exhibiting empathy, toward people who are maybe different than us in certain ways. Like I think intuitively, at least for me, like personal responsibility involves those kind of things, those kind of behaviors. But as a higher ed professional, then I wonder about both the kind of the practical, well, can we actually, get students to do that? And then is it our job, right, to get students to do that, at least in certain ways, right? Hence that kind of next to the last question there is, can we foster personal responsibility in this broader sense in an ethical way without imposing any particular set of values that we or a larger social group may have? And I think we can, to a limited extent, right? We can foster this broader sense of personal responsibility and help our students actually be more academically successful without, stepping on too many ethical toes. And the way to do that, I think, is by focusing on a different types of ethical identity, right? And so that second type of identity, that's kind of the disciplinary identity and the ethics of a profession, is sort of what I talked about in my response to Tammy, was that, disciplines have values, right? And disciplines have professions, right, have codes of conduct. Sometimes those are explicit, sometimes those are much more implicit. And so using those as a focus for talking about personal responsibility helps our students sort of prepare to be better students in the discipline and better professionals when they graduate. And so that, I think, is a pretty safe way to talk about personal responsibility and ethical reasoning in a broader sense, or in a much more concrete sense, right, than just the abstract. It doesn't explicitly get at the idea of behavior or observing behavior, but it might, right, if we have students doing internships, right, if we have students in the lab, and we're talking about lab safety, right, those aren't just, some of those rules, right, aren't just rules to avoid liability. They're rules because we don't want to hurt other people, and we want to help other people learn. And so those are the kind of things that we're talking about, and may, I think, occasion some reflection on ethics and personal responsibility within the context of a particular discipline, or a particular professional approach. The other thing that I think is really valuable, or might be useful to focus on, is our students' identity as students, right? So my background is philosophy of education, and so the bulk of my teaching has been talking about philosophy and philosophy of ed with students who are going to be teachers. So it's really easy for me then to talk about kind of the values that are embodied and practiced in higher ed, right? And the values that might be necessary for students to succeed, not just as professionals, but in their next 2 or 4, or however many years as students. And this gets into things like being on time and turning in work on time, and plagiarism or not plagiarizing, right? So, and here I think, we have a ready-made document, right? A ready-made source of conversation and reflection that all of us use, that all of us have, and we have to distribute, right? And that's the syllabus. And so, I've had sort of students, not just in order to get them to read the syllabus, but as an occasion to talk about kind of the behaviors and values expected of them in my class, but also expected of them as college students, right? Use the syllabus as kind of our initial reading document. And it becomes then an occasion for discussion and reflection about the values and responsibilities expected of students in college, and the values and responsibilities expected of teachers, right, of faculty in college, and even sometimes the values and responsibilities expected of the support staff or other folks, right, involved in higher ed. So students, we could talk about late work, for example, and why I don't allow, or do allow, I usually do, as my choice, do allow late work to be turned in, and why that is, why I think it is, and where my boundaries are, and then that becomes a way to discuss and potentially write and potentially generate student artifacts around kind of the ethical values of their identity as students, right, and my identity as faculty. And even then, it goes, I've left the door open for some negotiation about that sort of things, right? If because that demonstrates, another set of values about, that we're kind of in this together, that the classroom is a collaborative environment. So kind of using the syllabi as a text, right, not just to be sort of memorized, or as often the case, not just to be glanced at and then never looked at again, but as a text, right, to occasion the discussion of both disciplinary and student higher ed kind of values and expectations, I think allows us to have these discussions about personal responsibility in a way that's really relevant to students, and immediately meaningful, and that could ideally kind of carry them forward, right, into maybe some broader discussions, but also that I totally lost my train of thought, sorry. That's immediately relevant, immediately meaningful, but also kind of gets at that idea of, broader behaviors, right? So it's not just an academic, abstract, hypothetical exercise. They're exhibiting those behaviors throughout the semester, and you could talk to them about it when they fail to live up to those expectations. So also, one of the things, in terms of observing behavior, right, if students are engaged in experiential learning, right, there are sort of performance rubrics for those sorts of things, and those can be drawn upon and expanded and looked at, depending on the experiential learning involved and the discipline there, right? So again, the folks I work with in teacher ed who supervise student teachers, they certainly had plenty of performance rubrics that they or the supervising teacher would fill out. And responsibility was a big part of those, right? Both at the kind of very rudimentary level of showing up on time, but also at the much more sophisticated and probably meaningful level of, addressing all students equally and that sort of thing. The performance rubrics and the use of experiential learning to move personal responsibility from just an academic exercise to a more embodied, active sort of thing, I think is potentially useful. But again, there are lots of practical considerations there about class size and field work and supervision and all that kind of stuff. So it may only be kind of partially useful. Those are my sort of concrete suggestions, and the idea, right, is for the students to develop these intellectual tools of reflection and analysis, but also to kind of put them in action, right, in their identity as students and their identity as citizens and as disciplinary professionals. And so which really, if you put all that together, to kind of call out Aristotle a little bit, right, that's the idea of wisdom, right, of sort of thought in action, and action influencing how we think. I don't know if there's a rubric for that, but that's kind of where I hope all our students would end up. And I think personal responsibility is a good place to sort of start, that larger discussion about kind of this larger idea of wisdom, even though there's not really a rubric for it. So thoughts, questions, comments? Expostulations?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So, in putting it together for a faculty member to say, not aware of all the rubrics and how it all pieces together, that first part, I don't know how many faculty, and I think this is a great survey question, are realizing the connection between personal responsibility and ethical decision making.
Yeah.
And so while they may try to focus on personal responsibility, I don't know that anybody is going through, especially if you're not in a philosophy class, is even going through a 15-minute part of lecture even talking about ethical decision making and how those two relate. So I see you kind of gave us two options here. I see the second part where they're thinking strictly on the personal responsibility. I'm not sure that all the faculty are reading that first slide where you off from. And that's just my opinion.
No, that's good. I mean, I think, yeah, and I think you're right. I mean, there are kind of two options here. With the ideal for me, at least, being some blend of those sorts of things, right? We want our students to be able to sort of reason well and reason ethically, but also kind of put that into practice in a variety of contexts. And so, but by giving folks two options, what we may be able to do is then begin to have a conversation that sort of puts them together, right? Maybe in a good way, eventually. So that's a good point, though. Thank you. So the question in the chat, would you be willing to share activities relating to personal responsibility among different content areas from your college? Sure, as soon as I find out what they are, right? Only because I'm at a new college and am sort of figuring out, what's going on with the core objectives in a really different kind of institution in the Health Science Center. I do know that at UT Arlington, the institutional effectiveness folks and their website do a really great job of kind of laying out, what goes on with the core objectives there at UTA, how they're assessed, the rubrics they use to define them and that sort of thing. So certainly I would go to UTA and their institutional effectiveness site and where they talk about these core objectives. And then, the Leap Texas Hub we're kind of with this week as our focus on personal responsibility, we're beginning to kind of compile those sorts of resources as well, and we'll continue, to put them on the hub as well as kind of the more we get them. So one of the things we did for this week is a handful of faculty from across the state have kind of shared how they approach this objective in their classroom, both in terms of teaching it and in terms of assessing it. And those things are getting up there in short order, and we'll continue to put them together, I think, as the year progresses.
Well, I can say in history, decision making is obviously something we look at. And I like the way, the thing I struggle with that word ethical.
Yeah.
But I've been doing things like should museums in the West return artifacts to their homeland?
Yeah.
And get the students to see, first of all, when and why and how they were taken, and then look at multiple perspectives is not necessarily a right answer, and not make a decision, not really take a stand based on emotion,
Right.
But based on evidence. And then we look at something like about Franklin Roosevelt's intervention in the Holocaust. And one historian says, considering all the constraints he faced, he did a lot. And the other one was like, this was the biggest moral failure of his presidency, so we have to look at the evidence. Our goal is really not to get them to take a side, but just to evaluate the two arguments, looking at evidence, looking at primary source evidence. So you're making me feel a lot better about that exercise.
Yeah, good. No, I think that's a great exercise, right? And I think yeah, you come at it from your discipline. In the sciences, a lot of and this probably works maybe a little better at the graduate level, but it could also work in undergrad sciences, in terms of research ethics, right? And when is it ever okay to falsify data, or what data are meaningful? When do you need to throw data out? When it's appropriate to use other people's data and when it's not. All of that kind of stuff. My colleagues in the sciences, who do teach graduate students, often say, like, this is something that graduate students, they struggle with, right? Is that they sometimes they don't mean to cheat or to be ethically dishonest. They just don't know, right? Because they haven't had practice in doing this kind of stuff.
One of the things that I've found interesting in what you've been talking about is I tend to think in more concrete, practical type models. And one of the things is what you said about having the student think as a disciplined person. Whereas a lot of times, like in broadcasting, we teach philosophies of broadcasting. Here's the way you do it. Here's the way you go about gathering news and things of that nature. But I don't know whether we would, I'm trying to say is that maybe there's a possibility to develop a model that in that curriculum would explore the characteristics of a person in that discipline, so that you in sort of a simulation type thing. Here are the characteristics of what a philosopher, a historian does. And today we're going to look, just what John said, today we're going to look at whether we should give back artifacts from these 5 perspectives of a historian, so that you move the student into a role play type situation of being a historian from those characteristics, as opposed to just saying, what do you think? Should they go back or not? Right. And that would be interesting to put into courses for a person who's doing English or poetry. How does a poet think? As opposed to just writing poetry and having it graded and handed back to you.
Yeah, I love that idea, right? And I think one of the best kind of resources that I've seen with that is actually, you know, a critical thinking resource. It's and maybe you guys have all heard of this book, but it's um, Learning How to Think Things Through by I think it's Robert Nosich. And he talks about kind of learning to think, you know, as it's about critical thinking and developing critical thinking skills in students. Um, but he talks about learning to think as the professionals do, sort of as the disciplines do. And the idea of kind of role playing there, I think is pretty awesome, right? And in broadcasting, you can talk about, you know, well, what makes, you know, what are the qualities that make a good broadcaster or a good reporter or a good interviewer? You know, what do you need to be able to do and do well? Um, and those things aren't, I mean, some of those things are, you know, flat out skills, right? I mean, you know, write in this particular way, that sort of thing. But some of those things are going to be, you know, they're going to get into the ethical realm in terms of, you know, being a good listener or evaluating, you know, different points of view or making sure you seek out multiple sources. All of those kinds of things, you know, really get into the moral realm. And yeah, I love the idea of kind of asking students to kind of, you know, try on those hats, you know, as a way to have these discussions. That's great. Other sorts of questions or comments or things that you do or your institution does that, you know, that have helped you, you know, kind of wrap your head around personal responsibility. Well, for me, this is certainly, on one hand, right, it's an area I'm very comfortable in, right, coming from my disciplinary background in philosophy. But on the other hand, you know, as someone who is involved in assessment and, you know, who's, like I said, kind of come relatively recently to the idea of these Texas core objectives, right, it's a difficult one when you're talking about, well, how do I teach it and what do they mean and how do I assess it? So I hope this has been helpful to everybody and at least been, you know, giving you some things to think about. If nothing else, I think philosophers are pretty good at giving people things to think about, even if we don't solve all the problems for everyone. So any other final thoughts from anybody?
Is your dog okay?
Yeah, he's just, I apologize. I really do apologize for that.
Oh, very good.
It was, my wife was supposed to, you know, I'm working from home, so my wife was supposed to clear the dog and all the children out, but then my son got sick, and his doctor's appointment is right now. So that since the dog had to be left here, and he's been uncooperative, so
You're very responsible.
he's fine. He is fine. He's just upset about being, you know, outside. So I do apologize for the canine soundtrack.
Well, we
Thank all you guys
appreciate
very
it.
much for coming.
Look forward to seeing you in San Antonio,
Yeah.
San Antonio College.
Yeah, I will be down there shortly, I think, John.
Okay.
All right. Thank you all very much. Have a great afternoon, great week.
Thank you.